The oldest dangers are rarely the loudest. They wait in forgotten corridors, behind sealed doors, and within stories no one remembers to question. Good evening, dear listener. I am Professor Salamander, and tonight I invite you into a mystery that may have begun long before any living wizard drew breath. Beyond the candlelight of Hogwarts, something ancient stirs beneath layers of silence and stone. So settle in, keep your wand close, and let us uncover what fate set in motion centuries ago. The night the letter arrived, the wind howled against the ancient towers of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, with an insistence that seemed almost deliberate, as though the castle itself had been warned that something long hidden was about to awaken within its walls. And in the dimly lit Slytherin dormitory, where green-tinted lanterns cast wavering shadows across the stone, Draco Malfoy lay awake, staring at the ceiling, restless for reasons he could not yet name. It had been an ordinary term, or as ordinary as anything could be in a school where portraits whispered secrets and staircases shifted when one's attention faltered. Yet there was a tension in the air that even the most inattentive student could feel. A quiet tightening of something unseen, like the moment before a storm breaks. And Draco, though he would never admit it aloud, felt it more sharply than most, as though the castle itself had chosen him to notice. The next morning, everything changed. The Great Hall buzzed with murmurs far louder than the usual chatter over breakfast, and the owls, instead of delivering their routine letters, circled above in restless patterns before dropping a single parchment onto the staff table, where Professor McGonagall examined it with a stern expression that only deepened as she read, her lips tightening in a way that caused even the most talkative students to fall silent. Draco watched from his place at the Slytherin table, his eyes narrowing slightly, for he had been raised to notice such details, to understand that power often revealed itself not in grand displays, but in the smallest shifts of expression, and whatever message had arrived was not meant for ordinary eyes. By midday, the rumors had spread like wildfire. A new student was arriving. That alone would not have been unusual, but what unsettled everyone was the manner of their arrival, for no one had seen the name listed beforehand. No owl had carried notice to the school, and yet the headmistress herself had ordered preparations, as though the arrival had been expected in a way that no student could comprehend. By evening, the doors of the Great Hall opened once more, and every head turned. The figure who entered did not rush nor hesitate, but moved with a calm, deliberate pace that suggested neither fear nor arrogance, but something far more unsettling, a quiet certainty, as though they belonged wherever they chose to stand, and the air itself seemed to shift slightly as they approached the front, where the sorting hat waited. Draco leaned forward, his curiosity now impossible to conceal. For there was something undeniably strange about the newcomer, something that did not fit within the patterns he had spent his life learning to recognize. And when the candlelight caught their face, he felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, uncertainty. The sorting hat was placed upon their head. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, in a voice louder than usual, as though compelled by some unseen force, the hat declared, "Slytherin." A murmur swept through the hall, but Draco barely heard it, for his attention was fixed entirely on the newcomer, who removed the hat with steady hands and turned, their gaze passing briefly over the tables before settling, just for a second, on him. It was not a challenging look, nor a friendly one, but something far more unsettling, as though they had already measured him and found him lacking in some way he could not yet understand. They took their seat at the Slytherin table. No one spoke to them at first. Even those who would normally rush to greet a new addition hesitated, sensing perhaps what Draco himself felt, that this was no ordinary student, and that whatever secrets they carried were not meant to be uncovered lightly. Draco waited. He had never been one to rush into situations he did not fully understand, and yet, as the silence stretched, he realized with a faint irritation that he could not simply ignore this, for something about the newcomer demanded attention, demanded acknowledgement, as though their presence alone was a challenge. Finally, he spoke. "You're new," he said, his tone measured, his posture relaxed, though his eyes remained sharp, watching for any sign of weakness or deception. The newcomer turned to him. "Yes," they replied simply. Their voice was calm, steady, and entirely without the hesitation Draco had expected, and for a brief moment he found himself searching for something, anything, that might place them within the familiar hierarchies he understood. But there was nothing. No name was offered. No explanation. Just silence. Draco felt a flicker of annoyance. "Most people introduce themselves," he said, a slight edge entering his voice. A pause. Then, at last, the answer came. "My name," the newcomer said, "is not the important part." A strange response, and one that would have provoked laughter from others, yet no one laughed, for there was something in the way it was spoken that made mockery seem impossible, as though the words carried a weight that could not be dismissed. Draco leaned back slightly, studying them. "Then what is?" he asked. For the first time, the newcomer's expression shifted, not into a smile nor a frown, but into something far more subtle, a knowing look that suggested they understood far more than they were willing to say. "My blood," they replied quietly. The words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate, and though Draco did not yet know why, he felt a chill run through him, as though he had just stepped into something far larger than he had intended, something that would not allow him to walk away unchanged. Around them, the hall continued as though nothing had happened. Yet Draco knew, with a certainty that settled deep within him, that the balance of something unseen had shifted, and that whatever game had begun in that moment was one he could not afford to lose. And as the candles burned lower, and the shadows grew longer along the stone walls, one thought remained, clear and unshakable. This was only the beginning. The days that followed did not settle into familiarity, as new things at Hogwarts sometimes did after the first stir of gossip had burned itself away, but instead grew stranger with each passing hour, for the student who had entered Slytherin House beneath that veil of secrecy did not behave like someone eager to impress, nor like someone frightened of notice, but rather like one who had come to the castle with a purpose already fixed in the mind, and who regarded all the restless curiosity of others as no more troubling than rain striking a window pane far beyond concern. That alone would have been enough to fix the attention of the house upon them, because Slytherins, though often patient, were never indifferent to mystery where status and power might be involved. Yet what sharpened the matter into something sharper than schoolyard rumor was the fact that the newcomer seemed to know things that ought not to have been known. Not secrets of childish sort, nor stolen answers to homework, but older things, half-forgotten things, fragments of castle lore and wizarding custom which even pure-blood heirs heard only in dim stories told by elderly relations when the fire burned low and the house elves had long since withdrawn. Draco first noticed it during potions, when Professor Snape, with all his usual severity and with none of the patience he reserved for fools, asked the class to identify the proper use of powdered moonstone in a stabilizing draft, and while several hands rose at once, Eager either for praise or merely to avoid humiliation, the newcomer spoke without raising a hand at all, in a voice so even and assured that the room seemed to contract around it. "It is not the moonstone alone that stabilizes," they said, watching the pale fumes rise from the cauldron before them as though the answer were written there, "but the order in which it is added. Because when the silver residue is disturbed too late, the mixture clings to its own enchantment and turns inward." There followed a silence of the sort that rarely occurred in Snape's classroom, except immediately before cruelty. And Draco, who knew that silence well, expected a cutting remark to descend like a knife. Yet Snape did not sneer, did not deduct points, and did not accuse the speaker of arrogance, but instead narrowed his black eyes in a manner that was almost unreadable, then said very softly, "Correct," which in itself was remarkable enough to be discussed for the remainder of the day. Still, that was not what disturbed Draco most, because brilliance he understood and could measure against himself, against Granger, against any student whose cleverness had ever become tiresome to endure. Whereas what unsettled him was the look that passed across Snape's face after the answer had been given, a brief, cold recognition, gone in an instant, but real all the same, as though he had heard not merely intelligence, but an echo. By the third evening, the common room had begun to divide itself into circles of speculation, and names long dead or half-invented were whispered near the fire, while the newcomer sat apart beneath the greenish light filtered through the black lake, reading from a slim, leather-bound volume that bore no title on the spine, turning each page with the same composed care one might use in handling a relic taken from a family vault. Draco watched for nearly 10 minutes before deciding, with the kind of reckless resolve he preferred to call strategy, that waiting any longer would make him seem hesitant, and there were few things he despised more than seeming weak before an audience. He crossed the room with measured ease, ignoring the glances that followed him, and stopped beside the high-backed chair where the newcomer sat. "You have managed," he said, with the faintest edge of amusement laid across his voice, "to make an entire house talk of nothing else, which is either a talent or a mistake." The newcomer lifted their gaze from the book and regarded him with that same calm which had already begun to irritate him, not because it was proud, but because it could not be easily shaken. "People talk when they lack facts," they replied, closing the volume with one hand, though not setting it down, "and at Hogwarts they have too much time in which to imagine them." Draco gave a slight laugh, though he did not smile. "You speak as if you've known the place for years." "In some ways," said the newcomer, "I know it better than most who were born to it." That answer should have sounded absurd, yet once again it did not, and Draco felt that same faint chill creep beneath his ribs, the unpleasant sensation that he was standing half a step behind a game already in motion. He lowered his voice. "Who are you really?" For the first time since their arrival, the newcomer seemed to weigh the question seriously rather than dismiss it, and when they answered, it was not with mockery nor with secrecy for its own sake, but with a kind of deliberate caution, as though each word had first to be tested against danger. "I am someone my family tried very hard to hide," they said, "and someone another family has tried very hard to find." Draco's mind leapt at once toward the old categories, toward bloodlines, feuds, inheritances, marriages, alliances broken before his birth and spoken of only in guarded tones, and because he had grown up in a world where lineage was treated not as history, but as currency. He understood at once that this was no passing drama among distant relations, but something large enough to disturb those who liked their secrets buried. "Why hide you?" he asked. The newcomer's eyes drifted briefly toward the dark window, beyond which the black water pressed silently against the glass. Because some blood is prized for the wrong reasons, they said. And once people believe a name can open doors that magic alone cannot, they begin to kill for it. Draco said nothing for a moment, because though he had been raised on talk of blood and legacy and the weight of old houses, there was something in that answer that stripped all grandeur from such things and left behind only the ugliness hidden beneath. He might have pressed further had not the doors of the common room opened just then, admitting Theodore Knott, who moved quietly at the best of times, yet now seemed almost pale beneath the green light. He approached Draco first, though his eyes kept straying toward the newcomer. "There's someone asking questions," Knott murmured, too low for the others to hear. "Not students, not teachers, and not ministry, at least not openly. And Filch says a man was seen near the lower gates after dark." Draco frowned. "Since when do you listen to Filch?" "Since he was frightened," Knott said. That, more than anything, altered the air in the room, because Argus Filch feared almost everything magical, but not in the manner of men who had seen enough darkness to recognize it at a distance. And if he was frightened now, then something unusual had indeed crossed the grounds. The newcomer rose without haste, though their hand tightened almost invisibly on the untitled book. "They found me faster than I expected," they said. Draco turned sharply. "Found you," he repeated, the words dropping flat and hard between them. "So this has nothing to do with school gossip, does it?" "No," said the newcomer, and for the first time there was no shielded calm in the answer, only simple truth. "It has to do with why I was sent here at all." Across the common room the fire crackled, the lake pressed at the windows, and the low murmur of Slytherin voices continued in ignorance, while around Draco the evening seemed to narrow into something taut and dangerous. He ought, by every habit he possessed, to have stepped away then, ought to have decided that whatever hunted this strange air of hidden blood was not his concern, and yet the thought did not hold, because the danger had already crossed the threshold, and because some part of him, sharper than caution and harder to silence, had realized that if others were hunting this secret through Hogwarts, then the matter would soon belong to everyone. "Who is looking for you?" he asked, "and why would they come here?" The newcomer met his gaze, and when they spoke, their voice was nearly a whisper, though it seemed louder than any shout. "Because they believe," they said, "that beneath Hogwarts lies something sealed for my line alone, and if they are right, then the castle is no longer protecting me." They glanced toward the stone ceiling, toward the sleeping weight of the school above them, and then added with a quiet certainty that turned Draco's blood cold. "It is protecting whatever must never be opened." Draco did not sleep that night, though the dormitory around him eventually sank into the usual uneven hush of boys who had spent the day pretending to be older, colder, and less afraid than they truly were, because the words spoken in the common room had lodged in his thoughts like splinters beneath skin, impossible to ignore and too deep to draw out without pain. And as the waters of the lake cast their shifting green reflections across the ceiling above his bed, he lay with open eyes and saw again the face of the newcomer, calm even in warning, guarded even in honesty, as though fear had become so familiar a companion that it no longer needed to show itself plainly. By morning, the castle had taken on that peculiar atmosphere it sometimes wore before trouble made itself visible, when the corridors seemed no different to the eye. Yet every sound carried farther than usual, every whisper drew quicker glances, and even the portraits appeared more attentive, their painted eyes following students with a curiosity that suggested rumors had already climbed the walls ahead of the truth. At breakfast, Draco noticed two things at once, both of which disturbed him more than he cared to admit, because Professor McGonagall was speaking in low tones with Professor Snape near the staff table, which by itself would have been unremarkable had Snape not looked actively displeased to be receiving instructions, and because the newcomer was not seated at the Slytherin table, though their absence, for reasons Draco could not explain, seemed louder than the chatter filling the great hall. Blaise Zabini, who had a talent for sounding amused even when he was genuinely interested, leaned slightly nearer and said, without looking at Draco directly, "Your mysterious friend appears to have vanished, which will certainly improve the quality of breakfast gossip." Draco reached for his goblet, but did not drink. "They are not my friend." "No," said Blaise in that maddeningly smooth tone of his, "which is precisely why you spent half the evening watching them as though you expected either a duel or a confession." Draco gave him a flat look, though his attention was already drifting back toward the staff table, where McGonagall had now unfolded a square of parchment and was showing it to Snape, who read it, stiffened, and then turned his gaze across the hall with such abrupt sharpness that several students fell silent mid-sentence. A moment later, the side doors opened, and the newcomer entered beside Professor Flitwick, not looking frightened nor hurried, but somewhat paler than the day before, as though the night had stripped away whatever small reserve of strength they had been relying upon. And when they took their place at the table, neither Crabbe nor Goyle said a word, which in itself was nearly miraculous. Draco waited until potions to corner them. The dungeon classroom smelled of crushed herbs, damp stone, and brewing things best left unnamed, and while the rest of the class bent over their cauldrons beneath Snape's circling shadow, Draco moved to the narrow shelf where the newcomer was measuring ingredients. "You were gone this morning," he said quietly, keeping his face turned toward the pewter scales. "I was with the headmistress." "That is not an answer." "It is the only one you are getting here." Draco's jaw tightened. "You could at least decide," he murmured, "whether you want help or not." At that, the newcomer paused, one hand suspended above a jar of dried hellebore, and for the briefest instant something like weariness entered their expression. Not the weariness of a sleepless night alone, but that of someone accustomed to carrying too much alone for too long. "I do not know," they said softly, "whether bringing anyone close to this would help them or destroy them." Before Draco could respond, Snape's voice slid across the room like a blade. "Mr. Malfoy, unless the potion before you has somehow mastered itself, I suggest you devote less attention to conversation and more to not poisoning your classmates." A few students snickered, though weakly, and Draco returned to his work with a cold expression. Yet something in Snape's tone had struck him as deliberate, rather than merely cruel, because the professor did not often interfere so precisely unless he wished a subject dropped at once. That suspicion ripened by evening into certainty. After supper, as students moved through the corridors in knots of noise and candlelight, Draco slipped away from the main staircase and took the long stone passage that curved behind the abandoned classroom on the 4th floor, because he had seen Snape leave the Great Hall alone with unusual haste, and curiosity, once sharpened by danger, had become stronger in him than prudence. The passage was dim and nearly empty, lit only by widely spaced torches whose flames trembled in the draught. And when Draco reached the bend near the old tapestry of Wendelin the Weird dancing through fire, he heard voices ahead, too low to make out at first, but tense enough to halt him where he stood. He moved closer, careful now, one hand already near his wand. Snape stood partly turned away, black robes falling in still folds, while before him was the newcomer, upright but rigid, their untitled book clasped against one side like a shield. "You were told," Snape was saying in a voice so soft that Draco had to strain to catch it, that Hogwarts could protect you only if the seal remained dormant. I know what I was told. Then you also know that the disturbance beneath the castle has already begun. The newcomer's face did not change, yet their fingers tightened visibly against the leather cover. I did not awaken it. No, Snape replied, and there was something grim in the word, something almost reluctant. But your presence has. Draco felt the skin at the back of his neck go cold. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and then the newcomer said, in a lower voice still, "Have they crossed the boundary?" Snape's silence lasted long enough to become its own answer. At last he said, "Not fully, but someone is testing it." Draco did not think then, but acted because footsteps sounded from the far end of the corridor, too heavy and deliberate for wandering students, and a second later, a sharp crack split the air as one of the torch brackets beside Snape burst outward in a shower of sparks. "Down!" Snape barked. The corridor erupted. A jet of red light struck the wall where the newcomer had been standing, blasting stone dust into the air, and from the darkness beyond the bend, a hooded figure stepped forward, wand raised, followed by another and then a third, their faces obscured, their movements swift and practiced in a way that made clear this was no childish intrusion and no prank gone wrong. Draco had already drawn his wand before the first curse had finished blazing past. "Protego!" The shield charm sprang up in front of him just as a second spell collided with it, shuddering through his arm with enough force to send him half a step back, while Snape moved like black lightning into the middle of the passage, his own curse striking the nearest attacker squarely in the chest and hurling the figure into the wall. The newcomer did not flee. Instead, they opened the untitled book in one swift motion and pressed their palm to a page covered in silver ink, and for one impossible instant, the letters rose from the parchment like smoke lit from within, curling around their wrist and wand in narrow streams of pale fire. One of the hooded intruders saw it and shouted, not in fear but in triumph, "It is the heir!" The words seemed to strike the stone itself. At once, all restraint vanished, and the remaining attackers surged forward with deadly certainty, no longer testing, no longer searching, but trying to seize what they had come for before the chance slipped away. Draco fired again, a stinging hex that caught one assailant across the shoulder, though it barely slowed them, and Snape's curses cracked through the corridor with frightening precision, forcing two of the figures back, yet more footsteps rang out from the staircase beyond, proving with dreadful clarity that this had never been a lone attempt, but an entry prepared in advance. "Move!" Snape snapped at them both. He thrust the newcomer toward the side passage leading to the old charms storeroom, and Draco, without waiting to examine why he obeyed, followed close behind as spells shattered stone at their heels. The narrow passage twisted sharply and plunged into darkness, lit only by the newcomer's raised wand and the pulsing silver glow still lingering around the edges of the book, while behind them Snape sealed the entryway with a slammed door and a shouted incantation that made the hinges scream. For a few seconds there was only harsh breathing, darkness, and the muffled thunder of curses striking the barrier from the other side. Then Draco turned on the newcomer, fury rising at last through the shock. "You said they were looking for you," he hissed, keeping his voice low only because the danger was too near for shouting. "But you neglected to mention they were prepared to storm Hogwarts corridors to get you." The newcomer looked back at him, pale in the wand light, and there was now no room left for evasion, no calm distance, no careful half-truth. "They are not after me alone," they said. Another impact shook dust from the ceiling. Draco's eyes narrowed. Then what are they after? The newcomer swallowed once, then answered with a steadiness that made the truth worse, not better. My family did not merely carry royal blood, they said. Centuries ago, one of my ancestors bound a weapon beneath this castle, a weapon that obeys only that bloodline. And if those people outside that door force me to wake it, Hogwarts will become the first place it destroys. From beyond the sealed entrance came a crack like splitting iron, and Snape, who stood listening with wand drawn and face carved from cold fury, said only one sentence before turning deeper into the passage. Then pray, he said, that we reach the headmistress before they reach the seal. The narrow passage into which they had fled was not meant for hurried escape, nor for the passage of more than one person at a time, but rather for the slow and careful movement of those who knew its turns well. And as Draco followed behind the newcomer with Professor Snape close at their backs, the air itself seemed to resist them, thick with dust and old enchantments that had not been disturbed for decades, if not centuries, and every step forward felt as though it pressed against the weight of the castle's hidden memory. Behind them, the barrier that Snape had raised groaned under repeated impacts, each strike echoing through the stone with a violence that made clear their pursuers were not only determined, but dangerously skilled, because it required more than brute force to weaken a professor's ward so quickly, and as the muffled sounds of cracking magic carried through the corridor, Draco felt with growing certainty that this was no longer an intrusion that could be quietly contained, but the beginning of something that would soon reach far beyond the walls of Hogwarts. "Faster," Snape said, his voice low but edged with urgency that he did not bother to conceal, and though he did not look back, his wand remained angled toward the passage behind them, ready to strike again the moment the barrier failed. The newcomer moved ahead with surprising confidence, turning at junctions that Draco had never noticed before, slipping through narrow arches and concealed openings that appeared in the stone as though revealed only to those who knew how to look. And it struck Draco, even in that moment of danger, that this student had not merely been sent to Hogwarts for protection, but had arrived already carrying knowledge of its hidden veins, as though the castle itself had been studied like a map long before they ever crossed its gates. "Where does this lead?" Draco asked, keeping his voice steady despite the tension tightening in his chest. "To a place older than the school above it," the newcomer replied without slowing. "A place that was not built for students, nor for teaching, but for keeping something contained." Though Draco did not like the sound of that answer, because in a world where magic could bind, protect, and conceal, the act of containing something beneath a castle was rarely done without reason, and even more rarely done without cost. The passage widened suddenly into a low chamber where the ceiling arched just high enough to stand upright, and the walls bore carvings so worn with age that their meaning could no longer be easily read, though faint traces of silver in the grooves suggested that once, long ago, they had been filled with magic as well as stone. Snape halted there, turning sharply to face the passage behind them, and with a swift, precise movement, he drew his wand through the air, sealing the entrance with another ward layered upon the first, stronger and more complex, its faint shimmer settling across the stone like frost. "This will not hold them long," he said, his dark eyes shifting briefly to the newcomer. "So whatever you intend to do, you will do it now." The newcomer stepped forward into the center of the chamber, the untitled book still held tightly in one hand, and for a moment they simply stood there, as though listening to something no one else could hear, their gaze moving slowly across the walls, the floor, the faintly glowing lines that Draco had not noticed before, but now saw emerging like veins beneath the surface of the stone. "It is already awake," they said quietly. Draco felt the words settle into him with a cold weight. "You said your presence awakened it," he replied, unable to keep the sharpness from his voice. "So why is it reacting now?" "Because it is no longer waiting," the newcomer answered, their expression tightening for the first time since Draco had met them. "It has sensed the blood it was bound to obey, and it does not distinguish between command and threat." "Oh," Snape's gaze sharpened. "Explain that," he demanded. The newcomer turned to face him, and though their voice remained steady, there was no mistaking the gravity of what they were about to say. "The weapon beneath this castle was not made to serve willingly," they said. "It was forced into obedience through blood binding, and like all such magic, it resents the hand that holds it, which means that once awakened, it will act to preserve its own existence before it answers any command, even mine." A faint tremor passed through the floor beneath them, subtle but unmistakable, as though something vast had shifted in its sleep. Draco swallowed, though he refused to show fear. "And what exactly is it?" he asked. The newcomer hesitated, just long enough to make the silence unbearable, and then said, "A guardian that was never meant to be released." Before Draco could press further, a crack split the air behind them, sharp and final, and the ward across the passage flared brightly before shattering into fragments of fading light. "They are through," Snape said, already raising his wand. The chamber filled with a low, rising hum, not of sound alone, but of magic gathering, drawn upward from whatever lay beneath, and the faint silver lines in the floor began to glow more brightly, forming a pattern that spiraled inward toward the center, where the newcomer now stood. "Stand back," the newcomer said, their voice no longer calm but urgent, commanding in a way that did not invite argument. Draco hesitated only a fraction of a second before stepping away, though his eyes never left them. Because whatever was about to happen would either end the threat or unleash something far worse. The attackers burst into the chamber moments later, their hooded forms moving with ruthless efficiency, wands raised, spells already forming at their tips, and for an instant the scene seemed suspended between two forces, one pressing inward, the other rising from below. "It is too late to run," one of the intruders said, their voice harsh with triumph. "Call it, and we may yet spare the castle." The newcomer did not answer. Instead, they opened the book once more, their fingers tracing a line of silver script that flared at their touch. And then, with a steady breath, they spoke a single word in a language Draco did not recognize, a word that seemed to sink into the stone rather than echo through the air. The effect was immediate. The glowing lines on the floor surged with light, spreading outward in a web that reached the walls and climbed them in branching streams, and from the center of the chamber a deep, resonant sound rose. Not a roar nor a cry, but something older, heavier, like the shifting of a mountain beneath the earth. The attackers faltered. "What have you done?" One of them demanded, their confidence cracking for the first time. The newcomer's gaze remained fixed on the floor as the stone began to split along the glowing lines. "I have woken it," they said, and there was no triumph in the words, only grim acceptance. "But whether it obeys me or destroys us all depends on whether I can still command it." The ground trembled more violently now, and from the widening fissure in the center of the chamber, a pale light began to rise. Not bright, but cold and ancient, carrying with it a presence so vast that even Draco, who had been raised among tales of dark power and ambition, felt his breath catch as though the air itself had grown too heavy to draw. Snape stepped forward, placing himself slightly between Draco and the opening, his wand steady, his voice low. "Then do it quickly," he said. The fissure widened. The light grew stronger. And from the depths below, something began to move. The light that rose from the fissure did not flare like ordinary magic, nor pulse with the familiar rhythm of spells cast by wand and will, but instead emerged slowly and relentlessly, as though it had waited through centuries of silence for this single moment in which it might once again touch the world above. And as it spread across the chamber floor in pale, shifting strands, the air itself seemed to thin, as though something ancient had begun to breathe again after a long and unwilling sleep. Draco could not look away, though every instinct urged him to retreat, because what lay beneath the opening was not merely powerful, but fundamentally wrong in a way that could not be easily explained, as though it belonged not to the ordered structure of magic he had been taught, but to something older, something that had existed before rules were written and before wizards believed they could command the forces they touched. From the depths came a shape, though not one that could be fully understood at once, because it seemed to shift even as it rose, its edges dissolving into light and reforming again into something more solid, more defined, until at last it began to resemble a figure, tall beyond measure, its form composed of pale stone and silver lines that moved like veins beneath a surface that was neither entirely living nor entirely carved. The chamber fell silent. Even the attackers, who moments before had advanced with confidence and purpose, now stood frozen at the edges of the room, their wands lowered slightly as though they had encountered something that no plan had fully accounted for. And one of them, unable to contain the tremor in their voice, whispered, "It is real." The newcomer did not turn, did not acknowledge them, but instead stepped closer to the fissure, the untitled book held open before them, its pages now blazing with the same silver light that flowed through the rising figure. "Listen to me," they said, their voice steady despite the growing pressure in the room. "You were bound to my blood, and I stand before you now, not as a master, but as one who would command you for the sake of this place." The figure continued to rise. Its head, if it could be called that, tilted slightly, as though the words had reached it, yet had not been fully understood. And when it spoke, the sound did not come as a voice in the usual sense, but as a resonance that vibrated through the stone itself, deep and slow and vast beyond comprehension. "Blood. Remembered," it said. Draco felt the words, rather than heard them, the meaning settling into him with a weight that made his chest tighten, because there was no warmth in that recognition, no loyalty, only acknowledgement, like that of a force recognizing the key that might unlock it. "Yes," the newcomer replied, lifting the book slightly higher, "and by that memory I call you to stillness, to remain bound, and to reject those who seek to use you." A long pause followed. The figure did not move forward, but neither did it retreat, and the light within it pulsed faintly, as though something within was considering, measuring, deciding, and for a fleeting moment Draco believed it might obey. Then one of the attackers acted. Perhaps it was fear, or desperation, or the belief that hesitation would cost them everything, but a single curse flashed through the air, bright and violent, striking the newcomer squarely in the shoulder and driving them back a step, their grip on the book faltering just enough to break the fragile thread of control that had begun to form. "No!" Snape snapped, his own spell lashing out to strike the attacker, but the damage had already been done. The figure stirred. The light within it flared, no longer steady but sharp and erratic, and the resonance that followed was no longer neutral, but edged with something that might have been anger, or perhaps something older than anger, something that had no name in human language. Command. Broken, it intoned. The chamber shook. Stone cracked along the walls, and the fissure widened further as the figure rose higher, its full form now towering over them, its presence filling the space so completely that it seemed impossible for anything else to exist beside it. And as it turned its gaze, if such it could be called, toward the attackers, Draco understood with sudden clarity that whatever had been bound beneath Hogwarts had not been created to defend or to protect in any ordinary sense, but to act as a final, terrible answer to those who would breach what should never be reached. The first attacker did not even have time to scream. A surge of pale light struck them, not like a spell, but like a force, and in an instant they were thrown backward into the wall with such power that the stone itself cracked, their body falling limp before it even hit the ground. The others reacted at once, firing curses in rapid succession, red and green and blue light colliding with the figure's surface. Yet none of it seemed to matter, because the spells dissolved upon contact, swallowed by the shifting lines that ran through its form, leaving no mark, no trace of damage. "Fall back!" one of them shouted, panic breaking through at last, but there was nowhere to go. The entrance behind them had sealed itself once more, the passage now closed by the same glowing lines that covered the chamber, and as they turned, seeking escape, the figure moved again, not with speed, but with inevitability, like the slow descent of a blade that cannot be stopped once it has begun to fall. Draco's heart pounded. "This is not control," he said sharply, turning to the newcomer, who was struggling to regain their footing, their face pale, their breathing unsteady. "This is slaughter." "I know," they replied, their voice strained but resolute, "and if I do not regain command, it will not stop with them." Another surge of light filled the chamber, and a second attacker was thrown aside, their wand clattering across the floor as they fell, and the remaining figures pressed themselves back against the wall, their earlier confidence shattered into something raw and desperate. Snape moved quickly, his voice cutting through the chaos. "You must bind it again," he said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "Or we all die here." The newcomer nodded once, though the effort seemed to cost them, and with trembling hands they raised the book again, their fingers finding the same line of silver script, though this time the glow responded more slowly, more reluctantly, as though the connection had been damaged and would not easily be restored. "Listen to me," they said again, louder now, forcing the words through the weight pressing down upon them. "You are bound, you are held, and you will not act beyond the command of my blood." The figure paused. Its light flickered. For a moment, just a moment, it seemed to hesitate. Then, slowly, it turned its attention away from the attackers and towards the newcomer, and in that motion Draco saw something far worse than rage, because there was recognition there, but not of authority, not of obedience, but of origin. Blood. "Source," it said. The chamber fell into a terrible stillness. Draco understood then, with a clarity that came too late to be useful, that the danger had never been that the figure would refuse to obey, but that it would decide obedience was no longer necessary. The newcomer lowered the book slightly, their eyes fixed on the towering form before them. "Yes," they said quietly. And the figure moved closer. As the ancient guardian moved closer, the chamber seemed to contract around it, not because the stone walls truly shifted, but because its presence pressed upon every breath and every thought until the air itself felt too dense to endure. And Draco, who had known fear before in many forms, both humiliating and dangerous, understood at once that this was of a different order entirely, because one could plead with a man, deceive a wizard, outrun a creature, or shield oneself against a curse. But what stood before them now was not merely alive in any common sense, nor truly dead, nor even a beast guided by instinct, but a bound force given shape, old enough to have forgotten pity and patient enough to wait centuries for the failure of a single command. The newcomer stood their ground, though Draco saw the tremor that ran through the hand holding the silver-lit book, and when the guardian bent its terrible, faceless regard downward, its inner lines burning more brightly as though blood itself had called to blood across generations, the chamber floor answered with a low vibration that traveled up through Draco's boots and into his bones. "Step back," Snape said at once, his voice cold and precise, though the urgency beneath it was unmistakable, and he moved half a pace in front of Draco, wand lifted, not in foolish hope that a duel could settle such a thing, but in the instinctive manner of a man who would rather die resisting than stand idle before disaster. The newcomer did not move. "If I step back now," they said, and though their voice was strained, it did not break. "It will decide that fear has severed the binding, and once it reaches that conclusion, no call from my line will ever hold it again." The guardian lowered one immense hand, its fingers formed not of flesh, but of pale stone shot through with living silver, and when it hovered above the newcomer's head, the light within the room dimmed, as though every candle, torch, and charm in the castle above had just surrendered a fragment of itself to whatever old power had awakened below. "Source," it repeated, the word rolling through the chamber like distant thunder beneath earth. "Last branch, last voice." Draco's eyes narrowed. "Last branch." The phrase struck him at once with the shape of a revelation, because this had never been merely about inheritance in the ordinary sense, nor about the vanity of old names, but about survival, concealment, extinction nearly completed, and the newcomer, who had spoken so little of themselves, had suddenly been named by the thing their ancestors had bound as the final surviving heir of whatever hidden line had once commanded it. One of the hooded intruders, still pinned against the wall by terror more than force, found enough breath to speak. "Take them," he said hoarsely to the guardian, as though madness had mistaken desperation for opportunity. "Take the heir and obey." The effect was immediate and dreadful. The guardian turned, not swiftly, but with such final certainty that the intruder's courage collapsed before it had time to become regret, and a pulse of light struck the floor at his feet, not touching him directly, yet causing the stones beneath him to rise and fold like clenched hands, trapping his legs and dragging him down until only his arms and terrified face remained above the rock. Then the guardian spoke again, and this time its words were edged with something grimly deliberate, no lesser blood commands. Snape seized the moment. "There," he said sharply, turning to the newcomer. "It still recognizes law, which means the binding has weakened but not ended. So if there is a primary clause, a master injunction, or an ancestral prohibition, speak it now." The newcomer's eyes flickered with sudden understanding, though pain still marked their face where the curse had struck them. "There is one," they said, "but it was never meant to be used unless the line stood on the edge of extinction." Draco almost laughed, though there was no humor in him, only disbelief sharpened into anger. "We are well past the point for family caution." The newcomer looked at him then, truly looked at him, and whatever they saw in his face seemed to steady them more than the book in their hand. "You do not understand," they said quietly. "If I speak it, the guardian will not merely sleep again. It will sever itself from the living world forever, and everything my family guarded, every secret, every proof that the line existed, every trace of why others hunted us, will vanish with it." Oh, Draco stared back, and for one sharp moment he understood the true shape of the choice before them. Because for all the danger, for all the lives at stake, there remained in the center of this chaos a simpler, crueler thing. Namely that the newcomer had spent their life hidden, hunted, reduced to secrecy, and now stood at the threshold of losing the final proof that their bloodline had ever been more than rumor and ash. Behind them, the trapped intruder screamed as the stone tightened further around him. Snape's voice hardened. If you hesitate now, there will be no family history left to preserve, because the castle above us holds children, and once this thing reaches the upper corridors, it will kill indiscriminately. The newcomer closed their eyes for the briefest moment, not in surrender, but as though passing through grief too old to be named. When they opened them again, the hesitation was gone. They stepped forward until the Guardian's lowered hand hovered just above their brow, and lifting the silver-lit book with both hands, they began to speak in that same ancient language Draco had heard before, though now the words came in a longer chain, measured and resonant, each syllable seeming to draw light from the very lines in the floor. At once the chamber changed. The silver markings flared brighter than before, climbing the walls in intricate spirals, while the fissure in the floor began to narrow by degrees so slight that Draco at first thought he imagined it, and the Guardian itself grew still, not obedient, but arrested. Like a massive gate whose hinges had at last felt the return of the original key. The words continued. Draco did not understand them, yet he sensed their purpose in the way one senses the shape of a storm by the pressure in the air, and it became clear that this was not a command of attack or defense, but of ending, a formal closure written by ancestors who had perhaps foreseen that one day their own descendants would have to choose between legacy and the safety of the innocent. The Guardian's inner light dimmed a fraction. "Last voice," it said again, though now the words sounded less like recognition and more like mourning. The newcomer's voice did not falter. The hooded attackers, realizing too late what was happening, rallied in panic, and the last uninjured one raised his wand with a desperate cry, sending a curse straight toward the newcomer's exposed back. Draco moved before thought could catch him. He threw himself sideways, wand slashing through the air. Protego! The shield took the spell full on, exploding with such force that pain shot up his arm and across his shoulder, driving him to one knee, yet the curse broke apart in sparks before it could reach the speaker of the binding words. And in the same instant, Snape's counter-curse struck the attacker squarely, flinging him backward into the sealed wall where he collapsed, and did not rise. The newcomer turned only their eyes, not their body, and for a fraction of a second their gaze met Draco's with unmistakable surprise, followed by something quieter and far more dangerous to him than gratitude. Then they spoke the final line. The effect was absolute. Every silver mark in the chamber blazed white. The Guardian straightened to its full, impossible height, and the chamber filled with a sound unlike any Draco had heard before. Not a cry, not a command, but the long, deep shudder of ancient magic releasing its hold on the waking world. The pale stone of the Guardian began to crack. Light poured through the fractures, and as it did, the great hand above the newcomer's head withdrew, not violently, but almost gently, as though the thing, in the last fragment of law that remained to it, understood at last that the line which had bound it had chosen ending over dominion. Blood remembered, it said one final time. Blood released. Oh, then it shattered. Not into rubble, but into a storm of silver light that rose upward in spiraling currents, filling the chamber, rushing into the cracks in the walls, the floor, the sealed passage, and vanishing as though the castle itself had drawn the power back into its oldest bones. The fissure closed. The glowing lines faded. Silence crashed down so suddenly that Draco could hear his own breathing and the distant drip of water somewhere beyond the walls. For a moment, no one moved. Then the newcomer swayed. Draco was on his feet at once and reached them just as their knees buckled, catching them by the arm before they struck the stone. While the silver-lit book slipped from weakened fingers and fell shut upon the floor with a sound that seemed far too small after all that had happened. Snape crossed to them in 3 swift strides, his face harder than ever, though something in his eyes had changed. "Are you conscious?" he demanded. "Yes," the newcomer whispered, though their voice was barely there. "But it is gone." Snape glanced once at the book, then at the sealed and silent fissure, and nodded in the grim manner of one confirming both survival and loss. "Yes," he said. "It is." From the wall came a broken moan from one of the surviving intruders, and the spell of stillness snapped at once. Snape turned, wand raised. "Mr. Malfoy," he said, his tone once more all business and iron, "help me bind the living, because before the headmistress arrives, I intend to know who thought it wise to bring a war into Hogwarts." The silence that followed the destruction of the Guardian did not bring relief, nor the easing of tension that might have come after an ordinary danger had passed, but instead settled over the chamber like a weight too heavy to lift, because although the immediate threat had been ended, the cost of that ending lingered in the air with a sharpness that none of them could ignore. And as Draco steadied the weakened figure beside him, while Professor Snape moved with swift precision toward the fallen intruders, it became clear that what had been lost beneath the castle was not merely a weapon, but something far older and more final than any of them had been prepared to comprehend. Snape's voice cut through the stillness with practiced authority. "Bind them," he said, his wand already tracing the first of several complex spells that wrapped themselves around the nearest attacker, like tightening cords of shadow. Forcing their limbs rigid and silencing any attempt at speech before it could fully form. Draco released the newcomer only when he was certain they would not collapse entirely, though even then he remained close, his hand hovering for a moment as if uncertain whether to withdraw completely, because the moment had altered something he could not easily define, something that had shifted between them during the chaos, when instinct had taken the place of calculation. The surviving intruder struggled weakly as the magic tightened. "You have no idea," the man rasped, his voice hoarse and broken, "what you have just destroyed." Snape did not look up. "I have every idea," he replied coldly, securing the final binding with a flick of his wand that caused the man's body to still completely. "Which is why you will explain why you thought it wise to attack a protected student within Hogwarts walls." The man laughed, though the sound was hollow and edged with pain. "Protected," he repeated, the word twisting in his mouth. "You do not even know what they are." Draco felt his gaze shift at once toward the newcomer, who stood now with one hand pressed lightly against the stone wall for balance, their breathing shallow but controlled, their expression distant in a way that suggested they were no longer fully present in the chamber, but instead caught somewhere between exhaustion and the echo of what had just been lost. "Enough," Snape said sharply, though his tone suggested not dismissal, but postponement, because even he understood that the answers would not come here, not in this broken chamber beneath the castle, where the remnants of ancient magic still lingered like fading smoke. Footsteps echoed suddenly from the sealed passage. A moment later, the barrier dissolved with a precise and controlled unraveling of magic, and Professor McGonagall entered, her presence filling the space with a force entirely her own. Her expression stern, yet sharpened by something that bordered on anger rather than mere concern, because whatever message had reached her had clearly conveyed not rumor, but truth. Her eyes swept the chamber in a single measured glance, taking in the bound intruders, the cracked stone, the faint remnants of silver light still clinging to the floor, and finally the newcomer, whose posture she assessed with immediate precision. "Report," she said, her voice calm, though no one present could mistake the authority within it. Snape inclined his head slightly. "They breached the lower wards and attempted to seize the student," he said, his tone concise and exact. "In the process, the sealed construct beneath the castle was awakened, and the student was forced to initiate a termination binding to prevent it from reaching the upper levels." McGonagall's gaze sharpened. "Termination," she repeated, and for the briefest moment something like regret flickered across her face, though it vanished almost at once. "Then it is gone." "Yes," the newcomer said quietly, before Snape could answer. The word seemed to settle the matter. McGonagall nodded once, then turned to the intruders. "Remove their masks." Snape did so without hesitation, revealing faces that Draco did not recognize, though there was something in their expressions, something in the set of their features, that marked them unmistakably as individuals who had long since abandoned any pretense of ordinary life, because there was no fear in them now, only a bitter resignation that bordered on defiance. "They are not Death Eaters," Draco said, more to himself than to anyone else, because whatever he had expected, it had not been this. "No," Snape replied, his voice low. "They are something older, or at least something that believes itself to be." One of the bound men lifted his head with effort. "We are the last who remember," he said, his eyes fixed not on Snape or McGonagall, but on the newcomer. "And you have ended it." The newcomer did not answer. McGonagall stepped forward, her gaze unyielding. "You will be taken into custody," she said, "and whatever cause you believe you serve will be examined by those with the authority to judge it, though I suspect you will find little sympathy for attacks upon students within these grounds." The man gave a faint, humorless smile. "You misunderstand," he said. "We did not come to destroy the school." Draco's eyes narrowed. "Then what did you come to do?" The man's gaze shifted to him briefly, as though measuring whether the answer mattered. "We came to restore what was lost," he said, before returning his focus to the newcomer. "Because without that power, the balance has already begun to tilt, and what sleeps beyond the reach of your world will not remain asleep forever." A silence followed that statement, heavier than any that had come before, because though the words might have sounded like the delusions of a fanatic, there was something in the man's certainty that made them difficult to dismiss entirely. McGonagall did not respond to the implication. Instead, she turned to Snape. "Take them," she said, "and ensure they are secured in a place where no further surprises may occur." Snape nodded, and with a sharp movement of his wand, the bound intruders rose from the ground as though lifted by invisible chains, their bodies held rigid as he guided them toward the passage without another word. When they were gone, the chamber seemed emptier than before. McGonagall approached the newcomer, her expression no longer stern, but measured with careful attention. "You have done what was necessary," she said, her tone quieter now, though no less firm. "And I will not pretend that the choice was anything less than grave, but the safety of the school must always come first." The newcomer lowered their gaze. "I know," they replied. "That is why I made it." Draco watched them in silence, because there was no triumph in their voice, no sense of victory, only the quiet acknowledgement of something ended, something that could never be restored. "And what happens now?" he asked at last, unable to leave the question unspoken. McGonagall turned to him. "Now," she said, "we ensure that what occurred here remains contained, both in knowledge and in consequence, and we determine whether the threat that brought these individuals into the castle has truly been removed or merely delayed." Her gaze shifted briefly to the closed fissure. "Because if they believed this power was necessary," she continued, "then it is unlikely they will accept its loss without response." The newcomer straightened slightly, drawing what strength they could from sheer resolve. "They will not return for me," they said. "There is nothing left for them to take." McGonagall regarded them carefully. "Perhaps not," she said, "but that does not mean they will not seek something else." Draco felt the weight of that possibility settle into him, because the conflict, though resolved in one sense, had opened something larger, something that reached beyond the walls of Hogwarts and into whatever hidden world these intruders had come from. He looked once more at the place where the Guardian had stood. The stone was whole again, the light gone, the chamber silent. Yet the feeling remained. And as they began to leave, following McGonagall back through the winding passage toward the safety of the castle above, one thought pressed itself into Draco's mind with a clarity that would not fade. This had not been the end. It had only been the first move. The ascent back toward the upper corridors of the castle felt longer than any descent Draco had ever taken, not because the passage itself had changed, but because the silence that accompanied them now was filled with the weight of what had been left behind, and as the faint echoes of their footsteps traced the hidden path upward through the ancient stone, it became increasingly clear that though the immediate danger had been sealed beneath them, the consequences of that night had already begun to spread in ways that none of them could yet fully grasp. Professor McGonagall led without hesitation, her posture as composed as ever. Yet Draco, who had grown accustomed to reading the smallest shifts in expression among those who held power, could see that her mind was not at rest, because the tightness at the corners of her eyes and the measured precision of her pace spoke of calculation rather than relief, as though she were already considering not only what had occurred, but what must now be done to ensure that such an event could not be repeated. Behind her walked the newcomer, still pale, though steadier now than they had been in the chamber below, and while they did not lean on Draco for support, there remained a subtle closeness between them that had not existed before, as though the events they had endured together had drawn an unspoken line that neither could entirely ignore, even if neither yet chose to acknowledge it. When at last they emerged into the torchlit corridor above, the contrast struck Draco at once, because the familiar warmth of the castle seemed almost unreal after the cold, heavy presence of the chamber beneath, and the distant sounds of students moving through the halls carried a normalcy that felt fragile, as though it might shatter if anyone spoke too loudly of what had truly occurred. "You will say nothing of this," McGonagall said without turning, her voice firm and absolute. "Not to your classmates, not to your friends, and certainly not to anyone who might mistake rumor for truth." Draco inclined his head slightly. "I understand," he replied, though in truth he understood far more than she intended, because silence was not merely a rule within such matters, but a necessity, and he had been raised in a world where secrets were guarded not out of preference, but out of survival. The newcomer said nothing. That silence, however, was not the same as before, because where once it had been deliberate and controlled, now it carried a different quality, something quieter, heavier, as though words themselves had lost their importance in the face of what had been sacrificed. They reached the Slytherin corridor shortly thereafter, and McGonagall paused there, her gaze shifting between them one final time. "Return to your dormitory," she said, "and ensure that your absence raises no suspicion, because for the moment, it is better that this remains a disturbance no one can clearly define." She turned then, and left without further instruction, her robes sweeping softly across the stone as she moved away. For a moment, neither Draco nor the newcomer spoke. The corridor was empty, lit only by the steady glow of the wall sconces, and somewhere far above, the faint echo of laughter drifted down from the higher floors, a reminder that the rest of the castle remained blissfully unaware. "You destroyed it," Draco said at last, his voice low, though not accusing, merely stating what could no longer be denied. The newcomer did not look at him. "Yes," they replied. "You could have controlled it," he continued, not because he believed it entirely, but because the question pressed itself forward, demanding to be asked. A pause followed. Long enough that Draco wondered if there would be no answer at all. "I might have," the newcomer said finally, "for a time." Draco's expression hardened slightly. "And instead you chose to erase it." At that, the newcomer turned, meeting his gaze directly, and for the first time there was something sharp in their eyes. Not anger, but a kind of quiet certainty that could not be argued with. "I chose to prevent it from becoming what those people wanted it to be," they said, "because power that can be stolen will always be stolen, and power that cannot be controlled will always turn on those who try." Draco held their gaze, and though part of him resisted the conclusion, another part, the part shaped by everything he had seen that night, understood the truth within it, because whatever that guardian had been, it had not been something that could exist safely in the hands of anyone, no matter their blood or intention. "You have nothing left now," he said, the words leaving him before he had fully considered them. The newcomer did not flinch. "No," they agreed. "Nothing that they can take." The distinction did not escape Draco, though he chose not to press it further. Instead, he stepped past them, pushing open the entrance to the Slytherin common room, where the familiar green glow of the lake filtered through the windows, casting the room in its usual shifting light. And as they entered, the conversation within faltered briefly before resuming, because although their absence had been noted, no one had yet found cause to question it directly. Blaise Zabini looked up from his chair, one eyebrow lifting slightly. "You return," he said, his tone light, though his eyes were observant. "And here I had begun to think our mysterious addition had already decided that Hogwarts was beneath them." Draco gave a faint, dismissive shrug. "They were with a professor," he said, offering the simplest answer possible. Blaise inclined his head, accepting it without comment, though Draco knew well enough that the matter would not be entirely dismissed, because curiosity, once awakened, rarely faded without satisfaction. The newcomer took their seat once more in the corner, the same place they had occupied before, though now there was a difference in the way others regarded them. Not openly, not with direct suspicion, but with a subtle shift that suggested something had changed, something not yet understood, but felt all the same. Draco remained standing for a moment, watching them, because despite everything that had been said, everything that had been done, there remained one question that had not yet been answered. One that lingered beneath all the others like a shadow that refused to fade. At last, he crossed the room once more and stopped beside their chair. "You said they would not come for you again," he said quietly. The newcomer looked up. "Yes." Draco's gaze did not waver. "Then why do I feel," he continued, his voice steady, though edged with something he could not entirely conceal, that this is far from over. The newcomer held his gaze for a long moment. Then, slowly, they closed the untitled book, which now lay dark and silent in their hands, its silver glow gone as though it had never existed. Because, they said, their voice softer than before, though no less certain, they were never the only ones searching. The words settled between them, quiet and undeniable, and though the common room continued as it always had, filled with low conversation and shifting light, Draco felt once more that same tightening in the air, the same sense that something unseen had shifted just beyond reach. And as he turned away at last, taking his place among the others, one thought remained clear in his mind, sharper now than ever before. The Guardian was gone. But whatever had once required it to exist was still out there. The following morning arrived beneath a sky of dim silver cloud that pressed low over the castle turrets and made the windows of Hogwarts seem darker than usual, as though the school itself had not yet fully awakened from the violence of the previous night. And though the corridors filled as they always did with students carrying books, gossip, and the ordinary anxieties of lessons, Draco moved through them with the strained awareness of one who knows that beneath the surface of routine, something dangerous has already begun, and may at any moment rise again. He had expected exhaustion to dull his mind, yet the opposite had happened, because every detail of the chamber below returned to him with painful clarity. The cracking light, the faceless guardian, the sound of the final binding, and above all the look on the newcomer's face when the ancient power had vanished forever, which had not been the look of victory, but of deliberate loss. And Draco, who had spent much of his life believing that power once surrendered was the mark of a fool, now found that certainty unsettled in a manner he deeply disliked. At breakfast, the great hall rang with the usual noise of cutlery, owls, and careless chatter. Yet under it all, there was a low current of rumor, because word had spread that several professors had been moving through the castle long after curfew, that part of the fourth-floor corridor had been sealed off without explanation, and that Filch had been seen muttering to himself while polishing scorch marks from the stone, which, in a school such as Hogwarts, was enough to send speculation racing from table to table with all the force of wildfire. Pansy Parkinson, seated across from Draco, lowered her voice and said, "Something happened last night, and no one will say what, which means it was either dreadful or embarrassing, and I cannot decide which would be more entertaining." "Then do try to survive the suspense," Draco replied, though without much energy, because the game of dismissive answers felt thinner now than it once had. Blaise Zabini, who missed little and enjoyed proving it, studied him over the rim of his goblet. "You look tired," he said lightly, "which means either you have developed a conscience or you were involved." Draco gave him a long, unreadable look. "I advise you," he said, "to treasure uncertainty while you still possess it." Blaise's mouth twitched with faint amusement, but he did not press further. At the far end of the Slytherin table, the newcomer sat with the same composure as before, though to Draco's eye the calm was no longer effortless, because there was a weariness in the slight stillness of their shoulders and in the careful way they held the darkened book beside their plate, not as one guards an object of power, but as one keeps hold of the last piece of a house already burned. Nothing about them invited conversation, and yet everyone watched. The first open sign that matters were worsening came not from gossip, but from absence, because Professor Snape did not appear for breakfast, nor for the first bell, and in his place the potions lesson that morning was postponed by order of the headmistress. A rare disruption that sent renewed whispers crackling through the dungeons. The second sign came just before noon. Draco was leaving the library, where he had accomplished very little besides turning pages without seeing them, when he noticed the newcomer standing alone in the shadow of a narrow alcove near the corridor leading toward the hospital wing. And there was something in the stillness of their posture that stopped him at once, because it was not the stillness of rest, but of someone listening very carefully for a sound no one else could hear. He approached without announcing himself. "You have that look again?" he said quietly. The newcomer glanced toward him, but only briefly, as though most of their attention remained fixed elsewhere. "What look?" "The one that suggests the rest of us are late to a conversation already in progress." A faint shadow of a smile touched their face, though it vanished almost at once. "I heard something in the walls last night," they said. Draco's expression sharpened. "From the chamber?" "No," the newcomer replied, and now their voice had changed, becoming lower, more guarded, from higher up, and not beneath the castle, but within it, as though whatever those people wanted is not confined to the place where the guardian was bound. That sentence had barely settled when footsteps sounded at the end of the corridor, swift and precise, and Professor McGonagall emerged, her expression harder than either of them had yet seen it. "You are both to come with me," she said. Draco did not bother to ask why. They followed her in silence through a succession of turning corridors and moving staircases, until at last she led them not toward her office, but to a small, unused classroom high in the astronomy tower, a place so rarely visited that the dust upon the sills had remained undisturbed despite the term's constant bustle. Inside waited Professor Snape, looking more severe than ever and markedly paler beneath the candlelight, as though he had not slept at all, and beside him on a desk lay several objects arranged with unusual care. The darkened, untitled book, a folded scrap of ancient parchment, and a small silver medallion marked with a crest Draco did not recognize. McGonagall shut the door behind them with a firm movement of her wand. "What is said in this room," she began, "does not leave it." Draco inclined his head once. The newcomer said nothing. Snape stepped forward, his black eyes resting first on the newcomer, then on Draco, and though his expression gave little away, there was no mistaking the gravity of what he had to say. "The intruders captured last night have been removed from the castle," he said, "but not before one of them provided information which, regrettably, appears to be true." Draco folded his arms. "That they were not the only ones searching." "Precisely," Snape replied. McGonagall touched the scrap of parchment with 2 fingers. "The group that breached Hogwarts," she said, "was not acting independently, but as a splinter from a larger network of families, collectors, and political opportunists who believe that certain ancient magical claims can be revived through bloodline proof. And they were under the impression that the guardian beneath the castle was not the true prize, but the final lock." Draco's eyes went to the medallion. "Lock for what?" The newcomer answered before either professor could. "For the Crown Archive." The room fell still. Draco frowned. "That means nothing to me." "It should mean nothing to anyone," the newcomer said, their gaze fixed on the silver crest, "because my family erased it from history wherever they could." Snape's voice cut in. "Then now would be an excellent moment to explain why erasure has failed." The newcomer was silent for several seconds, and when they finally spoke, the tone of their voice had changed again, becoming heavier with memory than Draco had ever heard it. "My bloodline," they said, "was not royal in the Muggle sense, nor merely old in the wizarding sense, but descended from a hidden branch that once served as keepers of compacts made before the ministry existed, before Hogwarts was even what it became, and those compacts governed the custody of objects, names, and spells that were judged too dangerous to belong to any one family, faction, or crown. Draco listened despite himself, because whatever he had expected, it had not been this. The Guardian, the newcomer continued, was placed beneath Hogwarts because the founders agreed that the school, once established, would outlast courts, wars, and dynasties, and because one of my ancestors believed that the safest prison was one hidden beneath a place devoted to learning rather than conquest. McGonagall said quietly. The archive itself was then dispersed. Yes, said the newcomer, except for one chamber, the central vault, which could be opened only if the Guardian acknowledged the living heir, and the crest was presented with the surviving record. Their eyes moved at last to the book and the parchment on the desk. And now, they said, someone has both. Draco stared. The intruders had the crest? No, said Snape, with clipped irritation. We do. He touched the silver medallion. It was taken from one of them after his capture, which means they had already located a key fragment that should have vanished generations ago. And if one fragment survived, others may have as well. Draco looked from the medallion to the newcomer. So the Guardian was never the weapon they truly wanted. No, the newcomer said, and the quiet in their voice was worse than fear, because it carried certainty. It was the proof that the vault beneath the school is real. A cold understanding passed through Draco. And the thing in the walls, he said slowly, you think it is connected? The newcomer nodded. The vault was not built in one chamber alone. It was threaded through the castle in sealed routes and false spaces, so that no invader could reach it directly, and if the protections are reacting now, then the castle is shifting those routes. McGonagall's face grew grave. Which means, she said, that unless we find the access point before those outside do, the next breach may occur not below the school, but in the middle of it. There was a brief silence after that, and then Draco, who had spent much of the night and morning resisting the obvious, said the thing that had already become unavoidable. What do you need me to do? The newcomer looked at him with something like surprise, though it softened quickly into understanding. You should not involve yourself further, they said. This is my family's burden. Draco gave the faintest, iciest smile. That might have convinced me before armed strangers started breaking into my school and ancient guardians began exploding under the floor. Snape's gaze flickered between them, unreadable. McGonagall, however, answered before the newcomer could. You are involved already, she said to Draco, and since you have shown both discretion and competence, I am choosing not to waste either. She turned toward the desk and unfolded the scrap of parchment. It was brittle with age, and on it had been drawn a fragment of Hogwarts unlike any map Draco had seen, because it showed not the public corridors and towers, but narrow veins of hidden passage, dead-end chambers, and sealed circles buried between the walls like the roots of some enormous stone tree. At the center of the fragment, marked in faded silver, was a single symbol identical to the crest on the medallion. The archive route begins somewhere in the castle above ground, McGonagall said, and we now have reason to believe that the first accessible marker lies within reach of students. Snape's tone became sharp. Which is precisely why we must find it before curiosity, rumor, or our remaining enemies do. The newcomer stared at the map as though seeing an old wound reopened. Then they placed a hand lightly upon the table and said, almost to themselves, if the routes are waking, then the castle remembers. Draco looked at the silver crest, the dark book, the impossible map, and felt once more that same tightening in the air that had haunted him since the letter first arrived. The Guardian was gone. The enemy had not vanished. And somewhere inside Hogwarts, hidden within the living bones of the castle, a second secret had begun to stir. By the time they left the hidden classroom in the astronomy tower, the light outside had begun to pale toward afternoon, and the clouds that had hung over Hogwarts since morning now pressed so low against the battlements that the highest turrets seemed almost to vanish into them, which gave the castle the appearance not of a school perched above the grounds, but of some older and more secret stronghold, slowly withdrawing from the world beyond its walls. And as Draco descended the spiral stair behind Professor Snape and the newcomer, with McGonagall leading in stern silence, he could not shake the feeling that the entire castle was listening. The map fragment had been folded away, the silver medallion concealed, and the untitled book returned to the newcomer's keeping. Yet none of those acts diminished the force of what had been revealed, because now the danger possessed shape, direction, and method, which made it far more threatening than rumor. For vague fear could be endured and even ignored, but a hidden route through Hogwarts, one that might open not in the old chambers below, but among the ordinary passages used daily by students, was a problem that could not be dismissed as legend or sealed away with a simple command. They parted at the junction near the library, where McGonagall ordered them to continue their day as normally as possible, a phrase that would have sounded absurd under any lesser circumstances, because there was nothing normal in being expected to attend lessons after learning that the school itself was threaded with forgotten vault routes and ancient protections awakened by bloodline seals. And yet Draco understood precisely why she had given the order. Because panic among students would serve only those outside the walls who were already waiting for disorder to crack Hogwarts open from within. The newcomer lingered only a moment after the professors had gone. "If the marker is truly within student reach," they said quietly, their hand resting on the strap of the satchel that held the book, "then it will not remain hidden for long, because magical roots that begin to wake rarely do so gently, and the castle will start behaving strangely around it." Draco gave them a cool look, though his attention sharpened at once. "Hogwarts already behaves strangely around nearly everything." "Yes," the newcomer replied, and there was the faintest shadow of weary amusement in their expression. "But this will be stranger even by Hogwarts standards." That turned out to be true sooner than either of them expected. During Transfiguration, a cabinet at the back of the classroom began opening and shutting its doors of its own accord each time Professor McGonagall turned away, though no student was near it, and no charm cast upon it could fully still the movement. And later, while crossing the corridor outside Charms, Draco noticed that one of the wall sconces had been burning, not with its usual golden light, but with a pale silver flame that did not consume the wick beneath it, and vanished the instant anyone approached, leaving no trace that it had ever been there. By evening, these disturbances had begun to multiply in subtle but unmistakable ways. Portraits complained that their backgrounds no longer aligned with their frames, as though the painted corridors behind them had shifted slightly out of place. Suits of armor turned their helmets to face blank sections of wall, and the staircase leading from the entrance hall to the second floor refused 3 times in succession to land where it should, instead pausing before a narrow archway long since sealed with stone, while a draught cold enough to raise gooseflesh swept from the cracks around it before the stairs jerked away again, as though ashamed of having lingered. To the ordinary students, this was merely another curious stretch of Hogwarts mischief, something to be gossiped over by the fire before sleep. But to Draco, every sign now felt like a message half-written, and though he said little, he watched everything. After supper, as the common room filled with low conversation and green-tinted shadows. The newcomer sat apart once more, the untitled book open on their lap, though its pages remained dark, its earlier silver fire entirely absent. And Draco, who had spent the last hour pretending not to notice them, at last crossed the room and took the chair opposite without asking permission. "You are waiting for it to react," he said. The newcomer did not look up immediately. "I am hoping it will not." Draco leaned back slightly. "That sounds less convincing than I suspect you intended." At that, the newcomer lifted their gaze. "The book was written to answer the living protections of my family's line," they said, "but what happened in the chamber below severed much of that bond, which means that if the roots are truly moving now, the book may recognize them only in fragments, and fragments are rarely kind." Draco frowned. "You speak of your own inheritance as if it resents you." "It does," the newcomer replied simply. "Ancient protections are not like spells learned in classrooms because they are built from fear, sacrifice, and distrust of the future, which means they are made precisely to outlast the judgment of those who created them, and by the time descendants inherit such things, they often discover that the magic meant to serve them has already decided it serves only itself." That answer lingered unpleasantly in Draco's thoughts, because it carried more truth than comfort, and before he could decide whether to respond, Theodore Knott approached the table with the cautious manner of someone who had not intended to become involved in anything, and had nonetheless wandered too near its center. "There is a wall moving in the north corridor," Knott said in a low voice, not even attempting to make the statement sound reasonable. "Or at least I think it is moving, because there was a tapestry there half an hour ago, and now there is a statue, and I would have ignored it entirely if the statue had not been facing the other direction the second time I passed." Draco's eyes narrowed at once. "Which corridor?" "The one above the old classroom near the clock tower," Knott replied, then added, after a brief pause, "And before you ask, yes, I am certain I was sober." The newcomer had already closed the book. "Take us there." Knott blinked. "Us?" "Yes," said Draco, rising, "and for your own sake, Theo, I suggest you stop asking sensible questions." The corridor in question lay quiet when they reached it, lit by a line of wall lamps whose flames bent unnaturally toward a single stretch of stone between two narrow windows, and at first glance it appeared entirely ordinary, containing only a faded tapestry of a medieval wizard losing a duel to his own cat, and beside it, a marble statue of a witch holding a lantern. Yet Draco saw at once what Knott had meant, because there was a tension in the air there that differed from the rest of the castle, a pressure so faint it might have gone unnoticed by anyone not already searching for it. The newcomer stepped forward slowly. "The statue was not here before," they murmured. Knott folded his arms. "Thank you for preserving what remains of my confidence in my eyesight." Draco ignored him and drew his wand. "What do you see?" The newcomer did not answer at once, but instead touched the cover of the book and whispered something too soft for Draco to catch, whereupon a thin line of silver light crawled briefly across the leather spine before fading again. "There is a seam in the wall," they said at last, "but not a physical one, rather a magical join, old enough to be woven into the castle's structure instead of hidden from it, and the statue is not decoration, but a marker." Draco moved closer to the marble figure. The witch's face was worn smooth in places by time, yet her lantern remained strangely clear, its stone flame shaped not like fire, but like a downward-pointing tear, and upon the base of the statue, almost invisible unless the light struck at the proper angle, was carved the same crest they had seen on the medallion. For one moment, all three of them stood without speaking. Then Not, with rare lack of composure, said, "I assume we dislike that symbol." "We do not like it at all," Draco said. The newcomer ran their fingers lightly along the carved base, then stopped. "There is an indentation here," they said, small, circular, and concealed beneath the lowest fold of the robe. Draco's mind moved quickly. "The medallion." "Yes." He turned at once. "Then we fetch McGonagall." "No," the newcomer said, sharper than before. Draco looked back. "No? If the marker has surfaced this openly, it may not remain stable for long, and if the route shifts again before we test it, we may lose the entrance entirely." Not gave a strained laugh. "Excellent, because what every school evening requires is an impulsive decision involving ancient access points." Draco's gaze stayed fixed on the newcomer. "And what happens if placing the medallion there opens something we cannot close?" The newcomer met his stare with complete honesty, which in some ways was worse than secrecy. "Then we will at least know where the danger begins." That was not a comforting answer, yet it was enough. Draco drew the silver medallion from the inner pocket where he had concealed it after leaving the tower classroom, because McGonagall, perhaps deliberately or perhaps by oversight, had entrusted it temporarily to him while the professors went to verify other wards, and though he knew very well that using it without authority was reckless, he also knew that the castle had already begun to move, and that delay might prove the greater foolishness. He held the medallion up to the pale light. The crest seemed dull in his hand, merely old silver shaped by careful work, and yet as it neared the statue's base, the corridor changed. The flames in the wall lamps bent lower. The windows darkened as though night had fallen all at once. And from somewhere behind the stone came the low, unmistakable sound of gears, not metal turning within masonry, but something deeper, older, and far more deliberate, as though the castle had just recognized a forgotten command. "Draco," Not said quietly, and for perhaps the first time in years there was no irony in his voice at all. "Whatever you are about to do remember that I would have preferred an uneventful education." Draco did not smile. Neither did the newcomer. Very slowly he pressed the medallion into the hidden indentation. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the witch's stone lantern ignited with cold silver fire, and the wall beside the statue split down its center without a sound, opening inward upon a narrow stair spiraling into darkness where no stair had existed a moment before. From below came a breath of air so old and cold that it smelled not of dust alone, but of locked time, forgotten parchment, and magic waiting in perfect patience. And before any of them could speak, a voice rose from the dark beneath, faint but clear, not human, not echoing, and very much awake. "At last," it said, "the blood returns." The voice that rose from the darkness beneath the newly opened stair did not fade as an echo might, nor distort into something unrecognizable as it climbed the narrow spiral toward them, but instead remained perfectly clear, as though the distance between its source and the corridor above meant nothing at all. And as the cold air continued to drift upward, carrying with it the faint scent of sealed stone and ancient ink, Draco felt once more that same pressure he had sensed in the chamber below, though this time it was sharper, more focused, as if whatever waited in the depths had not merely awakened, but had been expecting this moment with patient certainty. Neither he nor the newcomer moved at first, because there are moments when action becomes secondary to understanding, and though Draco's instinct urged caution, there was also a pull in that darkness, subtle yet undeniable, a sense that the stair did not merely descend into a hidden space, but into a place that had been held apart from time itself, preserved by intention rather than neglect. Nott, who stood a half-step behind them, spoke first, though his voice was lower than Draco had ever heard it. "I believe," he said carefully, "that we have reached the point where continuing forward becomes an exceptionally poor idea." Draco did not turn. "You may remain here if you prefer." Nott gave a short, humorless breath. "I would," he replied, "if I believed for a moment that staying put would make me safer." The newcomer stepped forward. The silver light in the statue's lantern reflected faintly in their eyes, and though they showed no outward fear, Draco could see the tension in their posture, the readiness that had replaced the exhaustion of earlier, because whatever strength they had lost in the destruction of the Guardian had been forced back into place by necessity. "It is reacting to the bloodline," they said quietly. "The vault has recognized an heir." Draco's grip tightened slightly on his wand. "And if that voice belongs to something like the Guardian?" "It does not," the newcomer replied, though not with certainty, but with careful distinction. "The Guardian was bound to prevent entry. This speaks as if it expects us to enter." From below, the voice came again, not louder, but closer, as though it had risen one turn of the stair. "Delay is unnecessary," it said. "The passage has opened. The archive awaits its keeper." A silence followed. Draco exchanged a brief glance with the newcomer, and in that glance lay an unspoken agreement, because whatever lay beneath, whatever had been preserved through centuries of concealment and blood-bound protection, it could no longer be ignored. Not after the intruders had already risked everything to reach it, not after the castle itself had begun to shift in response. "Stay close," Draco said at last, though whether he meant it as instruction or reassurance, he did not fully know. Then he stepped onto the stair. The stone beneath his foot felt colder than the corridor above, not in the ordinary sense of temperature, but in a way that suggested it had not been touched by warmth for a very long time, and as he descended, the spiral narrowing around them, the light from above dimmed quickly, replaced by a faint, ambient glow that seemed to seep from the walls themselves, pale and steady, revealing carvings far more intricate than those in the chamber below. The newcomer followed without hesitation. Nott, after a moment of visible reluctance, came last. The stair turned once, then twice, and then opened into a chamber unlike any Draco had seen within Hogwarts, because it did not resemble a dungeon, nor a classroom, nor even a concealed passage, but something closer to a hall, though one built not for movement, but for containment, its walls lined with narrow recesses, each sealed by a thin barrier of faintly glowing magic, behind which rested objects of every kind. Books bound in materials Draco did not recognize. Small chests etched with sigils that pulsed faintly as they passed. Fragments of metal that hummed softly in the stillness, and at the center of the chamber stood a single pedestal of dark stone. Above the pedestal hovered a sphere of light. It was not bright nor large, yet it held the entire space together, as though the chamber itself existed in relation to it. And as Draco stepped forward, he felt at once that this was the heart of the archive, not because of its size, but because of the way the air seemed to draw toward it, as though everything else in the room existed only to support its presence. "You have arrived," the voice said. It did not come from the sphere. It came from behind it. A figure stepped into view. It was neither entirely solid nor entirely transparent, its form composed of faintly shifting lines of light. Shaped like a person yet lacking the full weight of flesh, and when it faced them, its features resolved just enough to suggest age, not in years, but in something deeper, something that had endured long beyond the span of ordinary life. Draco raised his wand at once. "What are you?" he demanded. The figure regarded him without reaction. "I am the last custodian of this archive," it said, "or what remains of one." The newcomer moved slightly forward. "You are bound to the vault," they said. "Yes," the figure replied, "bound to guard, to record, and to recognize." Its gaze shifted to them. "And I recognize you." A stillness fell over the chamber. The newcomer did not deny it. "I am the last of the line," they said. The figure inclined its head slightly. "The final bearer," it said, "the last voice by which the archive may be opened or sealed, preserved or erased." Draco's eyes flicked toward the sphere above the pedestal. "That," he said, "is the archive." "It is the core," the custodian replied. "The collected record of all that was deemed too dangerous to belong to any power that might misuse it, including spells unbound by limitation, contracts that cannot be undone, and knowledge that alters those who possess it." Not let out a low breath. "So naturally," he murmured, "it was hidden beneath a school." The custodian did not respond to the remark. Instead, it extended one hand toward the sphere. "Your blood has opened the root," it said to the newcomer. "You may now complete the process." The newcomer did not move. "Complete what process?" "The claim," the custodian replied. "The archive requires a living bearer to stabilize it, because without such a bearer, the protections will continue to fail. The routes will shift unpredictably, and eventually the contents will begin to surface in uncontrolled fragments throughout the castle." Draco felt a chill at that. "You mean," he said, "that if no one takes control, this place will start leaking whatever is stored here into Hogwarts?" "Yes." The word fell without emphasis, yet carried undeniable weight. The newcomer's hand tightened at their side. "And if I do take control?" The custodian regarded them steadily. "Then the archive becomes yours to govern, to protect, and to conceal, as your ancestors once did." A pause followed. "And if I refuse?" the newcomer asked. The custodian's answer came without delay. "Then the archive will remain unstable, and those who seek it will eventually succeed, because protections without a bearer degrade, and what has already begun cannot be undone without a living claim." Draco stepped closer, his voice sharp. "You are asking them to take responsibility for something powerful enough to threaten the entire castle." "I am not asking," the custodian said. "I am stating the condition under which the archive continues to exist." The newcomer looked at the sphere. The light within it pulsed faintly, as though aware of their attention, as though waiting. "You said," they began slowly, "that I could preserve it or erase it." "Yes." Draco's gaze snapped toward them. "Erase it," he said at once. "After what we saw below, after what those people were willing to do to reach it, you know what will happen if this falls into the wrong hands." The newcomer did not look at him. "I also know," they said, "what it means to erase the last trace of my family's purpose, to remove the final proof that we existed for more than hiding and running." Draco's expression hardened. "And if you keep it, you become the next target." "That is already true," the newcomer replied. The custodian spoke again. "The choice cannot be delayed," it said. "The archive is waking, and its roots will not remain stable for long without a bearer." The chamber seemed to grow quieter, as though even the sealed objects along the walls were waiting. Draco felt the weight of the moment settle into him, because the conflict had narrowed to a single point, no longer hidden in corridors or buried beneath stone, but standing plainly before them. Preserve the archive and risk its power. Destroy it and lose everything it contained. He looked at the newcomer. They stood motionless, their gaze fixed on the sphere, the pale light reflecting in their eyes, and for a moment Draco understood that whatever decision came next would not only determine the fate of the archive, but define who they would become afterward. The custodian lifted its hand slightly. "The blood must answer," it said. And the chamber waited. The chamber did not breathe, nor stir, nor echo, with even the faintest whisper of movement, because the silence that had fallen there was not empty, but filled with expectation so complete that even the dim glow along the walls seemed to hold itself in suspension, waiting upon the decision that had now narrowed all paths into one unavoidable moment. And Draco, who had spent much of his life believing that power was something to be seized, protected, and expanded at all costs, found himself for the first time hoping that the choice before the newcomer would not follow the logic he had been raised to admire. The sphere above the pedestal pulsed once, faint and steady, its light neither warm nor cold, but constant, as though it existed beyond such distinctions. And within that light, Draco could almost imagine the countless fragments of knowledge it contained, spells that could reshape the world, agreements that could bind entire lineages, secrets that had been buried not because they were forgotten, but because they were too dangerous to remember openly, and the weight of that unseen collection pressed upon him with a clarity that made the answer seem obvious. "Destroy it," he said again, though this time his voice carried not command, but urgency sharpened by understanding. Because whatever good it was meant to protect has already been threatened, and if it remains, others will come, stronger, more prepared, and next time there may not be anyone capable of stopping them. The newcomer did not turn. Their gaze remained fixed upon the sphere, though now there was something shifting within their expression, something that moved between grief and resolve. Because the truth of Draco's words was undeniable, yet so too was the cost of following them, and for one long moment it seemed as though time itself had stretched thin around them, unwilling to proceed until the choice had been spoken. "You think destruction is the end of this," they said quietly. Draco's jaw tightened. "I think it is the only way to prevent it from continuing." The custodian watched without interruption, its faint form steady, its presence neither urging nor resisting, because whatever remained of its purpose had been reduced to witnessing and recognition, not interference. And when it spoke again, its voice carried the same calm inevitability as before. "The archive does not exist to grant power," it said. "It exists to prevent the misuse of power, and without it, those same forces will not vanish, but simply go unrecorded, uncontained, and unchallenged." Draco's eyes flicked toward it, and with it, they will be drawn here like wolves to blood. "That is also true," the custodian replied. The newcomer exhaled slowly. "There is no safe path," they said. "No," the custodian answered. "There never was." The truth of that settled into the chamber like a final stone placed upon an already burdened scale, and in that moment the decision ceased to be about safety or risk, because both had been stripped away, leaving only consequence, and the newcomer, standing at the center of that narrowing choice, lifted their hand at last. They did not reach immediately for the sphere. Instead, they placed their hand upon the cover of the untitled book, which had remained closed since the Guardian's destruction, and for a brief instant Draco thought they might attempt to draw power from it again, though he knew well that its earlier connection had been severed. Yet, as their fingers rested there, a faint shimmer passed across its surface, Not the bright silver fire of before, but something quieter, dimmer, as though a fragment of its former purpose still lingered. "My family preserved this," they said, their voice steady now, though still soft. "Not to wield it, but to ensure that no one else could, and in the end, that purpose remains unchanged, even if the method must." They lifted their hand from the book. Then, slowly, they reached toward the sphere. The light within it responded at once, not flaring, but deepening, as though it recognized the presence of the blood it had been bound to answer. And as their fingers passed through its surface, the chamber filled with a low resonance, not unlike the one that had preceded the Guardian's awakening, yet far more contained, far more focused, because this was not a force breaking free, but one being deliberately altered. "What are you doing?" Draco said, his voice tightening despite himself. The newcomer did not look at him. "I am not destroying it," they said, "and I am not claiming it." The custodian's form flickered faintly. "Then you risk instability." "No," the newcomer replied, and now there was certainty in their tone, unshaken and clear, "because there is a third option." For a moment, even the custodian seemed to hesitate. "Explain." The newcomer's hand remained within the sphere, and as they spoke, the light within it began to shift, its steady pulse breaking into smaller patterns, threads of brightness weaving through one another in intricate lines that spread outward toward the sealed recesses along the walls. "I will not bind the archive to myself," they said, "because that would make me its sole keeper, and I will not erase it, because that would destroy what must remain hidden from those who would misuse it. So instead I will break the central claim and disperse the core into the castle itself, dividing its contents among the oldest protections so that no single person, bloodline, or faction can ever hold it again." Draco stared. "You are scattering it." "Yes." "That is madness," he said, though even as he spoke, he began to understand. "It is balance," the newcomer answered, and now they did turn, meeting his gaze directly, "because Hogwarts itself will become the keeper, not a person, not a family, but the structure that has already proven it can endure beyond all of us." The custodian's light flickered more strongly. "Such an act has never been attempted." "Then it is time it was," the newcomer said. The chamber trembled. The sphere's light fractured into countless threads, each one extending outward like roots seeking new ground, and the sealed recesses along the walls responded, their barriers flaring open just enough to receive the fragments, while deeper within the stone, unseen roots awakened, carrying the divided power into hidden layers of the castle where no map could fully follow. The resonance grew stronger, yet it did not feel violent nor uncontrolled, but purposeful, as though the archive itself had accepted the change, recognizing in it a continuation rather than an ending. The custodian's form began to dissolve. "The central record is breaking," it said, not in alarm, but in acknowledgement, "and with it, my function ends." The newcomer withdrew their hand. "That was always the outcome," they said quietly. The custodian inclined its head once more. "The archive will remain," it said, "but it will no longer answer to blood alone, and in that, your line's final act surpasses its first." Its light dimmed. Then it was gone. The chamber fell silent once more, though not with the same weight as before, because something fundamental had changed, something that could not be reversed. And as Draco looked around, he saw that the sealed recesses had closed again, their contents hidden once more. Yet now they seemed part of the castle rather than separate from it, woven into its fabric in a way that felt both safer and far more unpredictable. Not exhaled slowly. "Well," he said, his voice returning at last to something resembling its usual tone. "If anyone asks, I shall be entirely unable to explain what just happened." Draco did not answer. He looked at the newcomer. "It is done," they said. "Yes," Draco replied. "And now," they added, with the faintest trace of something lighter beneath the exhaustion, "there is nothing left for them to take." Draco considered that, then shook his head slightly. "No," he said. "Now there is nothing left for them to control." A quiet understanding passed between them. The conflict had ended, not with destruction, nor with possession, but with transformation. And as they turned at last toward the stair that would lead them back into the ordinary corridors of Hogwarts, Draco knew that though the secret beneath the castle would remain hidden, it had not vanished, but become something else, something far more difficult to seize. And as they emerged once more into the torchlit hall above, where the statue stood silent and the wall had sealed itself without trace, one final thought settled firmly in his mind. Power, once bound to blood, had been freed. And in that freedom, it had become something no one could ever claim again.
Наш любий Драко кинувся захищати спадкоємця і прийняв удар закляття на себе, хоча міг просто залишитися осторонь. Це була лише одна мить, але саме такі миті визначають, ким ми є насправді. Знаєте, як там каже, мені здається, ми часто дуже уявляємо мужність як щось велике і героїчне. Наче для неї потрібні особливі обставини, небезпека або слава, але історія показує інше. Справжня сміливість народжується тоді, коли ти не маєш гарантій успіху. Коли тобі просто страшно, коли легше відступити, але ти все одно робиш крок вперед, бо знаєш, що це правильно. Драко не знав, чим усе закінчиться. Він не міг бути впевненим у нагороді чи перемозі. Він просто вирішив захистити когось у момент, коли це було найважливіше. І в нашому житті мужність виглядає дуже схоже. Іноді це сказати правду, коли мовчать. Іноді підтримати людину, яку всі залишили. Іноді зробити правильний вибір, навіть якщо ніхто цього не бачить. Бо хоробрість – це не відсутність страху, це рішення не дозволити страху вирішувати за себе. І саме такі рішення мають змінити історію. І, знаєте, такі рішення і чарівні, і наші власні. Тому пробуємо приймати свої рішення, намагаємося їх обдумовувати, тому що реально вони можуть дуже багато значити в нашому житті і багато для нас зробити. Тому не боїмося. Я надіюся, ви вловили суть того, що я хотів донести. Дякую всім за увагу. До наступних відео.